Good evening, and welcome back to Dreaming Lore. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of forgotten cities, where beneath the cobblestone streets, hidden chambers lie waiting, dark and silent, full of secrets that have lingered for centuries. These are the places where history's deepest mysteries are buried, where whispers of old legends rise from the stone and fade into the night. From the ancient castles of Europe to the forgotten tunnels beneath towering cities, the dungeons of old carry more than the weight of stone. They hold the weight of time itself. Whether you're here to unwind, to drift into sleep, or simply to let your mind wander through the whispers of the past, I'm so glad you've joined us. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now let's begin. Beneath the quiet stones of medieval cities, there were places seldom spoken of. These were the dungeons, chambers cut into the earth, where darkness lingered long after candles had burned away. They were part of the foundations of castles, town halls, and ancient keeps. They were used for storage, for punishment, and for secrets best left in silence. People in those times lived close to the earth, and they knew the weight of stone pressing down above them. The dungeons reminded them of that weight, for they were cold, and they were still, and they seemed to hold their own memory of fear. When cities began to grow in Europe, many of them were built upon older settlements. Layers of history pressed upon each other. Beneath the streets and churches of London, Paris, and Prague, older passages remained. Sometimes they were Roman, carved in centuries past. Sometimes they were little more than natural caves, widened by human hands. These underground places were reused again and again, becoming dungeons, cellars, and vaults. Because they were hidden, people imagined they carried curses. In the dim air, echoes lasted longer than they should. Stones dripped with water, even in dry seasons. The ground seemed to breathe, and so stories began to spread of what lingered in those depths. People spoke of chains rusting into walls, though no prisoner had been kept there for years. They said the air was thick with the sighs of the dead. Rats moved in silence, their small bodies stirring fears that had nothing to do with their size. The damp carried the smell of decay, and when a torch guttered out, the dark seemed heavier than night. In such places, imagination worked against the weary. Tales of cursed dungeons grew naturally. They were not shouted in marketplaces, but whispered near firesides late in the evening. Children listened with wide eyes, while elders reminded them that some doors underground were never meant to be opened again. The use of these dungeons was practical. Lords of castles stored wine there, for the earth kept it cool. Armories placed weapons underground to protect them from fire. Cities kept grain hidden from thieves in vaults below their walls. Yet, alongside this practical use, dungeons became places of judgment. Prisoners of war were led down staircases slick with moss. Thieves were chained against stone pillars. Accused heretics waited in the dark for trials that never promised freedom. It was not always cruelty that made these places feared, but the feeling that they were far from sunlight, cut away from the world of ordinary life. Some believed curses came from those who died unjustly in these chambers. A knight captured in battle might have been promised ransom, but left to starve. A woman accused of witchcraft might have been forgotten there until only bones remained. Their final breaths, it was said, lingered in the walls. And so, anyone who touched the stones would feel a shiver, as though that last breath had moved across their skin. Even priests hesitated to bless these places, for the darkness seemed unwilling to lift. Legends told of secret passages running from dungeons to rivers or forests beyond the city walls. These passages were used for escape, or for smuggling, or for things less easily named. Sometimes such tunnels were real, leading to hidden doors long collapsed. Other times, they were imagined, invented to explain why sounds echoed in strange ways underground. Yet always the thought was the same. The earth below the city was not empty. It held paths, and those paths held danger. The cursed reputation of dungeons was not limited to one land. In France, there were stories of forgotten prisoners scratching marks into the stone, marks that glowed faintly by candlelight centuries later. In Germany, people spoke of chains that rattled when no one touched them. In Italy, beneath the hills of old towns, it was said that shadows sometimes moved against the torchlight, as though something unseen walked just beyond. In England, the Tower of London's underground chambers became notorious, their silence heavier than the cries of the ravens above. All of these stories spread slowly, carried by merchants, by soldiers, by pilgrims. When people settled for the night in roadside inns, they traded these tales. Some listened for the thrill, others to remind themselves of dangers left behind. But always the rhythm of the stories was steady. Dungeons beneath medieval cities were places no one entered lightly. They were used, they were feared, and they were remembered. As centuries passed, some dungeons fell into ruin. The stones collapsed, passages filled with earth, doors sealed and forgotten. Yet others remained, maintained by towns that still found use for them. Tourists in later ages would descend and feel the same chill their ancestors had described. The curses seemed to endure, not as violent hauntings, but as quiet weight. The air was thick, the silence deep, the memory of the past clinging to every surface. The story of these dungeons begins not with curses, but with the human need to build, to store, to defend. Yet in time, fear grew alongside stone. The next part of the story turns toward the origins of these underground places, how they were carved, why they were shaped as they were, and how the first whispers of curses began to take root in the hearts of those who built them. Beneath the growing cities of the Middle Ages, the origins of the dungeons began with simple necessity. Stone was abundant, and the labor of masons and workers shaped it into walls, arches, and corridors. In many towns, the first underground chambers were not prisons, but storerooms. Grain was kept below ground where the temperature was steady. Salted meat and barrels of ale rested in the cool air. Wine cellars stretched beneath manors and monasteries. At first, there was nothing sinister about these spaces. They were carved to serve the needs of survival. Over time, however, the purposes changed. As castles rose, lords required places for those awaiting trial or punishment. The lower levels of these castles were naturally chosen. It was easier to guard prisoners below the earth than above. Thick walls muffled cries, and a single staircase made escape unlikely. The very weight of the stone above seemed to press against those inside, reminding them of their powerlessness. Thus the storage rooms gradually became dungeons, places for confinement and fear. The architecture of these underground chambers followed simple patterns. Narrow passages led to small square rooms. Ceilings were vaulted with heavy stone to prevent collapse. Doors were thick oak, bound with iron. In some places, tiny openings were cut into the walls to allow air to pass, though they let in little light. Chains were fixed into the stone, either hammered directly into the walls or secured to pillars. Such details were not originally made for curses, but they shaped the feeling of the spaces, giving them a mood of endless waiting. As cities expanded, builders often reused what was already there. Roman tunnels became medieval dungeons. Old cisterns were repurposed as holding cells. Even natural caves, when found beneath a city, were widened and set with doors. The age of the stones gave them weight in people's imagination. A wall laid down by hands long dead seemed to echo with memory. People whispered that the earth itself held grudges, that old foundations carried shadows into the present. Thus, the stories of curses grew alongside the physical chambers. In many places, the church was asked to sanctify the underground rooms. Priests would descend, swinging censers heavy with incense. Latin prayers filled the corridors, yet even blessed stones seemed unchanged. The air remained damp and torches sputtered. Prisoners spoke of dreams that troubled them more deeply underground than in the open. Some claimed to see figures standing in the corners, watching silently, disappearing when the torchlight moved. These stories were repeated enough that they entered folklore. People came to believe that the very act of confinement bred curses. If a prisoner died unjustly, the curse was said to grow stronger. Their soul, unable to leave, became part of the dungeon itself. The stone absorbed their final despair. Even when centuries passed and the names of those prisoners were forgotten, the unease remained. It was not one story, but thousands of quiet endings layered into the earth. The origins of the curses were also explained through older beliefs. Long before castles, there were traditions that the underworld lay close beneath the surface. To dig downward was to approach places of spirits. Folklore across Europe spoke of beings dwelling below, dwarves in German tales, fair folk in Celtic lands, and shadowy spirits in Slavic stories. These beings were said to dislike intrusion. When humans carved chambers underground, the curses might have been seen as the anger of these hidden dwellers. Such beliefs blended easily with the grim realities of dungeons. The reputation of cursed dungeons also grew because of secrecy. Few were allowed to see them. Prisoners were led down in chains. Guards kept watch, but ordinary townsfolk rarely entered. What they imagined filled the silence. Rumors spread in taverns and at markets. If a prisoner disappeared and never returned, people assumed the dungeon had swallowed them. When noises echoed through the ground at night, people believed curses stirred beneath their feet. Thus, imagination wove itself into stone. In some towns, children were warned not to linger near the old staircases that led below. They were told stories of doors that pulled themselves open, of voices calling softly from the dark. These warnings, meant to keep them safe, also kept the curses alive in memory. Generations passed, and the stories grew heavier, though the actual dungeons often stood unchanged. The origins of the cursed dungeons, then, lie not only in stone and mortar, but in the minds of those who lived above them. A simple storeroom became a prison. A prison became a place of fear, and fear became legend. As time went on, the progression of events would add new layers to these tales. Wars, betrayals, and punishments filled the dungeons with more shadows. Each century gave its own weight to the story, and the curses deepened with every retelling. The next part of this slow tale will move gently into those centuries of progression, describing how dungeons were used during times of conflict, and how their reputation grew darker as history unfolded above them. Through the passing centuries, the dungeons beneath medieval cities became more than places of storage or silence. They were pressed into service whenever conflict rose, whenever rulers needed somewhere to place their enemies, and whenever fear outweighed mercy. War was frequent in the Middle Ages. Rival lords fought for land. Kings contested borders. Cities defended their walls against siege. Each time, prisoners were taken, and each time, the dungeons below became their resting place. When armies marched across fields, those captured in battle were often led back to castles. A knight of good birth might expect ransom, but until the gold was paid, he waited underground. Common soldiers with no wealth behind them were left in the same dark chambers but with little hope of release. Their names vanished from memory, but their presence gave weight to the belief that dungeons were filled with despair. Stories spread that the moans of the defeated echoed long after the war had ended. Trials, too, added to this reputation. In cities where courts grew in importance, the accused were held in dungeons while judgment was decided. Thieves waited there, uncertain whether they would be fined, mutilated, or hanged. Heretics accused of false belief were placed underground until inquisitors called them forth. Even innocent men and women, falsely accused, endured the silence of stone before the truth could be found. Each story, told later at a hearth or in a marketplace, reminded listeners that the dungeon was the threshold of punishment. During sieges, the dungeons carried a different weight. Castles and towns under attack sealed their gates. Food grew scarce. Water was rationed. Prisoners in the dungeons were often forgotten. Guards focused on the walls above, and those below starved. Some chronicles mention these deaths only briefly, but the people remembered them more vividly. They said curses rose strongest in times of siege, when the forgotten cried out with no one to hear. The stones absorbed their hunger, their silence, and their last breath. As centuries passed, more legends grew from these events. People said that during great wars, shadows were seen moving behind barred doors when no prisoners were left alive. Torches carried below flickered even when there was no wind. Guards told of chains clinking faintly, though none were touched. These were small details, repeated across Europe, building a steady rhythm of fear. The dungeons also became tools of authority. Rulers used them not only for criminals, but for political enemies. A noble who challenged his king might be placed underground, not killed outright, but kept in silence to break his spirit. Scholars who questioned church teachings might be left in darkness until they confessed. The dungeon thus became more than stone and chains. It was a symbol of power. People feared it as much as the gallows or the battlefield, for it held a slower kind of death. Yet the stories remained calm in their telling. They did not describe fierce ghosts or sudden terrors. Instead, they spoke of waiting, of silence that never ended, of footsteps echoing endlessly in corridors that led nowhere. The curses were not shouts but whispers, not flames, but cold air moving softly past the ear. This quietness gave the legends their strength. In some towns, whole networks of passages were built during times of war. Beneath Prague, beneath Carcassonne, beneath York, tunnels ran for miles. Some were dug to smuggle food during sieges. Others were escape routes for lords and bishops. Over time, these passages became linked in people's minds with the dungeons. It was said that the cursed air spread through the tunnels, filling even those places not meant for prisons. A city might appear peaceful above ground, but beneath, an unseen weight pressed on the earth. By the later Middle Ages, dungeons were known everywhere. Travelers from one land to another shared stories that seemed alike. Chains rattling, shadows shifting, air too heavy to breathe. These tales moved with merchants and pilgrims, weaving a common thread of fear through many cultures. The curses were not bound to one city. They belonged to the very idea of the dungeon itself. As wars continued and trials multiplied, the stories deepened. People spoke not only of cursed stones, but of entire cities sitting upon restless earth. They said that each dungeon was connected by invisible roots, like branches of the same dark tree. Wherever one went, the same silence could be found. The belief was simple, slow, and steady. Beneath all the stone walls of medieval life, something heavy waited in the dark. And so, the progression of events gave the dungeons a permanent place in folklore. From war to trial to siege, they gathered stories like water gathers in deep wells. The curses were not sudden inventions, but long, quiet growth. Each generation added its own layer until the tales felt as old as the stones themselves. The story now turns toward the conflicts and turning points that shaped the strongest of these legends. In the next part, it will describe how betrayals, executions, and forgotten punishments carved deeper fears into the memory of these places, making the curses seem heavier with every passing century. Beneath the surface of medieval cities, the dungeons took on their darkest character during times of betrayal and punishment. These were the moments when ordinary confinement turned into legend, when the whispers of curses grew heavier than before. History remembered kings and lords, but the dungeons remembered the quiet endings of those who displeased them. It was said that when a ruler wished not only to punish but also to erase, the dungeon was chosen as the stage. Executions often began above ground, but their shadows reached below. A prisoner might wait for days in the cold chamber before being led to the courtyard. Chains were removed, a last glance of daylight given, and then the sentence was carried out. The people above saw the punishment, but those who had shared the silence below remembered the heavy air more than the strike of the blade. They said the dungeons kept the final fear, repeating it endlessly in the stone. In this way, executions did not end with death. They continued underground. Betrayal gave rise to some of the most enduring stories. Noble families often fought among themselves, and when one member sought to take power from another, the dungeon was the place where trust was broken most deeply. A brother who plotted against a brother, a cousin who reached too far. Many ended their days below. The curses born of betrayal were thought to be the strongest. Those betrayed by their own kin, by their closest allies, were said to leave behind anger too sharp to fade. In the dark, where they had once waited for ransom or mercy, only bitterness remained. In times of heresy trials, the dungeons grew more infamous still. The accused, waiting for questioning by inquisitors, were held below in silence. Some recanted, others held firm, but all were remembered as part of the growing legend. People whispered that the walls themselves listened to their prayers, and when the accused were burned above, the dungeons below seemed to sigh with smoke that never cleared. The curses of heretics were feared because they were thought to call upon powers beyond the church, lingering in the stones long after torches went cold. Forgotten punishments added another layer of dread. Not every prisoner was executed. Some were left to wait, week after week, until they faded away. Records of their names disappeared, but their absence was remembered. In some cities, it was said that footsteps could still be heard pacing behind barred doors that led to empty chambers. These were called the footsteps of the forgotten. Guards, who spent long hours above the staircases, spoke of hearing them even when no one had been imprisoned for decades. Legends of cursed objects also grew in these centuries. Chains, said to never rust though centuries passed. Doors, heavy with iron, that closed themselves after nightfall. Rings of keys that turned cold in the guard's hand. Each object was ordinary, yet stories gave them weight. If a prisoner had died in chains, those chains were thought to carry the curse. If a door had closed on a starving man, that door was said to hold his final breath. People avoided touching these things when possible, and when they did, they whispered a prayer. The turning points in history often reinforced these beliefs. During uprisings, rebels thrown into dungeons were remembered by their supporters as martyrs. Their curses, it was said, rose to protect future generations. During times of plague, dungeons were filled not with criminals, but with the sick, isolated to stop the spread. The curses of the dying were thought to seep into the ground, giving the earth beneath the city an even heavier weight. Each crisis deepened the memory of these underground places. Through all of this, the telling remained steady and calm. People did not speak of sudden hauntings, but of long silences. They said curses did not rush upon a man, but crept slowly, settling into him like damp air into cloth. A person who lingered too long in a dungeon might feel unwell for weeks. Food tasted dull. Sleep grew restless. These were considered signs that the curses had followed him back to the surface. The effect was not violent, but quiet, and in its quietness, more feared. Thus, betrayals, executions, heresies, and plagues all became woven into the memory of the dungeons. They were not single events, but steady layers placed one upon another, forming the deep foundation of the legends. Each city had its own version, yet all shared the same rhythm. Betrayal below, punishment above, curses in between. The story now moves toward the impact of these dungeons upon the culture of medieval life. It will tell how people shaped their beliefs, their warnings, and their daily habits around the idea of what lay beneath their feet, and how the cursed dungeons became part of the quiet fabric of their lives. The dungeons beneath medieval cities did not remain separate from daily life. Even if most townspeople never descended into them, their presence shaped how people thought, how they prayed, and how they explained the world around them. In the same way that cathedrals inspired awe with their height, dungeons inspired caution with their depth. They were the other half of the city. One lifted eyes upward to heaven, the other reminded them of darkness below. Stories of the dungeons passed quietly through generations. Parents warned children not to stray near the heavy doors that led down. Market gossip carried whispers of prisoners chained for years, even if those prisoners had been gone for decades. Folklore was not written in books, but spoken at hearthsides, and always the dungeons played their part. The city might celebrate feast days in the squares above, but beneath the same stones lay silence. This balance reminded people that joy and fear, sunlight and shadow, lived side by side. The curses became explanations for small misfortunes. If a baker's bread spoiled faster than expected, someone might say the oven stood too near the old dungeon walls. If a merchant lost coin on the road, neighbors might whisper that he had passed by the cursed entrance without making the sign of the cross. In this way, the legends gave shape to accidents and losses. They offered reasons where none could be seen. The curses were not always terrifying. They were simply part of the rhythm of life. Guilds and councils also acknowledged the dungeons in their own way. When disputes arose, prisoners were taken below. This constant use meant that ordinary citizens understood the dungeons as both punishment and protection. They were feared, but also accepted. Much like plague or famine, they were part of the order of things. People might avoid them, but they did not question their existence. In time, this quiet acceptance made the curses feel even stronger. The dungeons were never challenged, only endured. The presence of the dungeons shaped architecture as well. Houses and shops in older cities sometimes had cellars that connected, unknowingly, to deeper chambers. Families who found these hidden passages often sealed them quickly, believing that to leave them open was to invite misfortune. In places where sealing was not possible, they kept candles burning longer than usual, convinced that light discouraged whatever lingered below. Rituals also formed around these fears. Some guards refused to begin their shifts without whispering a prayer at the stairhead. Some families placed sprigs of herbs near the foundations of their homes to ward off curses. Priests were occasionally asked to bless wine cellars, not because of the wine, but because the cellars lay too close to remembered dungeons. Over time, these small practices became part of the unseen map of daily life. Travelers hearing of such customs carried the tales further. Pilgrims spoke of the cursed dungeons of one city to the people of another. Merchants repeated warnings as they moved along trade routes. In this way, the curses were spread not only through experience, but through expectation. By the 15th century, it was common for people across Europe to assume that beneath any old city there must be a cursed dungeon, whether or not one truly existed. The legend became larger than the stones themselves. Yet the cultural impact was not entirely fearful. There was also a sense of respect. People recognized that the dungeons were reminders of justice, however harsh. They were reminders of history, of wars and trials that had shaped the city. In a strange way, the curses carried dignity. They kept memory alive, even if that memory was heavy. Some storytellers said that without the dungeons, the city above would forget too easily. The curses ensured that the past could not be erased. In art and song, the influence appeared as well. Ballads sometimes spoke of lovers separated, one kept in the light, the other trapped below. Carvings in wood or stone showed chained figures, not only as warnings, but as symbols of endurance. Even stained glass, glowing in cathedrals, sometimes hinted at underground chambers by depicting dark arches beneath holy scenes. The idea of dungeons became woven into the imagination, shaping how people pictured both punishment and memory. And so, the cultural impact was deep and steady. The dungeons beneath medieval cities were not only places of stone, they were places in the mind. They shaped how people explained misfortune, how they taught caution, and how they remembered their own history. The curses were not loud, but they were lasting. The story now turns toward the later centuries, when many of these dungeons began to fall into ruin, and yet their legends grew stronger still. In the next part, the focus will move gently to the fading of their practical use and the rising of their role as memory, myth, and quiet warning across the generations. As the centuries passed, the practical use of the dungeons beneath medieval cities slowly began to fade. The castles that had once stood as fortresses of power gradually fell into disrepair. The need for dungeons as places of imprisonment, storage, or refuge diminished as kingdoms expanded and legal systems evolved. New methods of incarceration were developed, and towns began to build larger, more modern prisons above ground. But even as these dungeons became obsolete, their legacy did not fade. In fact, their role in the collective imagination grew more potent. The stone walls that had once held prisoners began to crumble. The passageways, once vital and feared, grew over with earth and ivy. In some places, the dungeons were forgotten entirely, sealed behind walls that were built up as cities modernized. What had once been a necessary part of the city's infrastructure became little more than a distant memory. Yet, the myths surrounding them endured, unaffected by time's decay. In some cases, the dungeons were abandoned but not removed. Local stories took hold of the empty spaces, creating tales of hidden treasure, ghosts, and forgotten kings who still haunted the halls. They became places of mystery, places to be avoided. Travelers passing through old towns sometimes spoke of hearing strange sounds from behind heavy doors, though no one had entered those places in years. These stories, based on the lingering presence of the dungeons, took on a life of their own. As the use of dungeons in their original form died out, their place in culture was cemented. They became symbols of darker times, reminders of past injustices, and vessels for the fears of the unknown. The curses attributed to them grew even more widespread. The idea that something sinister could remain in the stones, long after the prisoners had been released or forgotten, persisted. Some of the legends around these dungeons took a supernatural turn. People began to say that those who ventured into these ruins might be trapped by a lingering curse, unable to escape until the dungeon had claimed them. They told stories of people who had disappeared after entering the abandoned cells, only to be found years later, lost and maddened. Others spoke of flickering lights seen deep within the crumbling corridors, shadows that seemed to move even without the presence of a person. But even as these stories grew more fantastical, they remained rooted in the same belief: that the dungeons, though emptied of their former use, held something deeper, something unseen but ever present. In towns where dungeons had once been a part of daily life, the old cellars and tunnels were treated with reverence and caution. People no longer feared punishment or imprisonment, but the memory of what those places had represented lingered. The town elders still cautioned against wandering too close to the forgotten gates. There was, after all, a long history to those places, one filled with anguish and regret, and though the dungeons themselves were now just stones, their shadows still loomed large. Over time, the dungeons became places of reflection rather than fear. They were used as quiet reminders of history. Some towns preserved parts of their old dungeons as museums, showing visitors how justice had been meted out in centuries past. In these quiet places, the legends and myths were retold. The curses, while still remembered, were now part of a larger narrative, one that spoke to the passage of time and the shifting nature of human societies. In literature, the dungeon took on new forms. Writers, inspired by the old legends, wove tales of forgotten places, of cursed chambers beneath the earth, and of the ghosts of the past still trapped in those dark, silent halls. The idea of the dungeon as a symbol of punishment faded, but the image of the dungeon as a place of memory, of eternal darkness, remained a powerful one. The curse of the dungeon was no longer just about those who had been trapped within it, but about the history it carried with it. The enduring power of these dungeons came not from their physical presence, but from the stories they had given birth to. These were the stories of human suffering, of betrayal, of forgotten lives. They were the stories of a time when life was harsh, and justice was often swift and unforgiving. And though the dungeons themselves may have crumbled to dust, the stories they inspired lived on. In the end, the curses that surrounded these dungeons were not curses of ghosts or shadows, but curses of history, of lives lived and lost beneath the weight of stone. They were a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that even as we move forward, we carry with us the echoes of the past. The story now moves toward its soft, reflective close. Though the dungeons no longer held prisoners, though their curses were less spoken of, they remained as part of the memory of the cities above. They had served their purpose as both warning and symbol, and now they existed only in the whispers of history, in the quiet stories that reminded us all of what once was. As the centuries stretched on, the dungeons faded further into the past. Their walls, once dark and oppressive, became little more than ruins. The chains rusted, the torches flickered out, and the air in those places grew still, as if waiting for something that would never come. The curses that had clung to them like shadows began to loosen, not because they were gone, but because they were no longer needed. The people of the towns above, who had once feared the dungeons and the stories that surrounded them, began to look at them differently. The air of mystery that had surrounded these underground chambers softened, turning from fear into quiet reverence. The curses became stories, not warnings. They were tales told in the evening, around firesides, with the crackling of logs filling the silence. People no longer feared the dungeons, they respected them as a part of history. In the quiet of these ruins, where vines crept up through cracks and the stones stood in solitude, there was a peace that had not existed when the dungeons were full of prisoners and fear. The curses, now softened by time, lingered not as threats, but as memories. The earth, which had once seemed so heavy, now seemed to breathe with a gentle sigh, as if all that had once been trapped beneath it was slowly being set free. The dungeons, though empty, were not forgotten. They stood as quiet witnesses to the passing of time. They were no longer places of punishment, but places of reflection. Those who visited them, whether scholars, tourists, or descendants of those who had lived through the harshness of the past, came to see them not as dark, cursed places, but as markers of history, places that had borne witness to the resilience of human spirit, even in the most difficult of times. And so, the curses that once seemed so powerful, so lasting, began to fade into the background of the stories people told. They were still there, of course, in the whispers of old legends and in the quiet corners of forgotten libraries, but they no longer held the weight they once did. The dungeons had served their purpose, not only as places of confinement, but as vessels for memory. They reminded people of what had been, of the mistakes and the struggles, but they also reminded them of what had been learned, of how far people had come since those dark days. The stone, though worn and weathered, carried within it a sense of peace. For even in the deepest silence, there was a quiet understanding that all things, even curses, would one day be released. The dungeons, once feared, had become a part of the slow rhythm of time. They had witnessed countless lives, countless stories, and had played their part in shaping the history of the world. But now, in the stillness, they were a reminder that even the heaviest burdens could be lifted, that even the deepest shadows could fade into the light of understanding. As night fell across the cities that had once depended on them, the dungeons stood as silent guardians of the past, no longer places of dread, but places of reflection. The curses were no longer spoken with fear, but with respect, for they had shaped the world in ways that no one could have fully understood at the time. And so, as the last light of day slipped away, and the world settled into the quiet of night, the dungeons, though empty, remained, quiet, peaceful, and timeless, waiting for those who would remember, and for those who would one day let go of the past. And with that, the story of the cursed dungeons beneath medieval cities comes to a soft, final close. The echoes of the past may linger, but in the stillness of the night, they no longer hold sway. They are simply a part of the rhythm of history, a memory wrapped in stone and time. Thank you for drifting into this tale with me. Until next time, when more secrets will unfold, and we'll find ourselves lost once more in the world of dreaming lore.